I'm an Associate Director for the Center for Puerto Rican Studies and also the Chief Librarian and Archivist. We welcome you tonight. We have a fellow colleague. I met Christina 2 years ago because Christina was invited by the Hoboken Historical Society Museum to do an investigation on Catholics in Hoboken. And they wrote a proposal for the Historical Preservation and Research Partnership Centro. And we were happy to receive the proposal. One of the best proposals we have received so far. Very complete, and so we were happy to collaborate with them. Also, you had an activity that you showed some photographs. Remember, was that last year?
Yes.
Yeah, that was also very interesting. So let me read a little bit about Christina. Ziegler-McPherson is a public historian in the New York area. She holds a PhD in history from the University of California in Santa Barbara, and she's the author of Americanization in the States, Immigrant Social Welfare Policy, Citizenship, and National Identity in the United States. Published by the University Press in Florida, 2009. She's also published several encyclopedia essays about immigration, and she has done historical research for institutions as the one I mentioned, the Hoboken Historical Museum and the Museum of the City of New York. And she had taught also history at the Empire State College of SUNY. So please welcome Christina.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Centro very much for inviting me, for supporting my research in this. Particularly thank you to Alberto, to Dr. Melendez, to Pedro Juan Hernandez, to Evelyn and Jose for all your support and assistance. What I'd like to do tonight is first describe the project that I did, lay out the academic scholarship on this question, then describe the actual oral history project that I did and share some of the conclusions that I came to, as well as then at the end critique my work and say what I thought worked, what didn't work, and sort of reflect on oral history as a methodology in examining these kind of questions of assimilation, community development, etc. So I'd like to first explain what the project was that I did with the Hoboken Historical Museum. In our application to Centro in June of 2009, we proposed to document the role of the Roman Catholic Church in the development of the Puerto Rican community in Hoboken, New Jersey between 1945 and 1975. The purpose of the project was to develop new archival-worthy material by doing oral history interviews with between 8 to 12 individuals in Hoboken. The individuals to be interviewed were to be parishioners, priests, and other religious at St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church, which has been the main parish for Spanish-speaking residents in Hoboken since the 1950s. I conducted a total of 10 interviews with 14 people between November 2009 and February 2010, and then did supplementary archival research at the Archdiocese of Newark's archive at Seton Hall University in South Orange. So I'd like to first give you a little context, a little background for the academic questions I wanted to examine. The amount of scholarship on Puerto Ricans and the Catholic Church in the U.S. is fairly small, which reflects the fact that scholars of the Puerto Rican experience have traditionally not been interested in examining institutions like the Church, but instead have preferred to focus on community groups or on issues of community development and ethno-racial discrimination. In addition, few scholars of American Catholicism and religion have examined Puerto Ricans' religious and spiritual traditions the way they have studied Irish, Italian, or other immigrant groups from traditionally Catholic countries. The few scholars who have examined Puerto Ricans and religion are academics trained in traditional Catholic scholarship, such as Jaime Vidal, Ana Maria Diaz-Stevens, and Father Joseph Fitzpatrick. Now, one of the main questions that these scholars and others who study religion are interested in is different forms of what they call lived faith, the cultural ethos of a religion as people experience it in their everyday lives. So, for example, cultural and economic oppression and discrimination in Great Britain and America caused Irish Catholics to cling fiercely to their faith, but this faith came to be defined by a strong sense of obligation and sacrifice. In Latin America, by contrast, the traditional union of church and state produced a religious tradition that emphasizes celebration, ritual, and the power of the miraculous. The result of these different forms of lived Catholicism was, according to most Catholic scholars, a strong culture clash within the American church when Irish American Catholics encountered Puerto Ricans and other Latin American immigrants in the 1940s and 1950s. Now, similar conflicts had occurred in the 19th and early 20th centuries among American Catholics and Irish, German, Italian, and Slavic Catholic immigrants. To resolve these cultural conflicts within parishes and to better serve linguistic minorities, the American Church created national or linguistic parishes based on nationality or language instead of geography. In New York, the small but growing number of Spanish speakers, who were primarily Spaniards but also Puerto Ricans and Cubans, who settled in the city before World War II, were served by two national parishes in East Harlem. La Milagrosa, Our Lady of the Miraculous Medal, which was established in 1926, and Santa Agonia, Holy Agony, established in 1930. La Milagrosa was closed in 1978, but Holy Agony is still open on 3rd Avenue at 101st Street. But the New York Church began to move away from the national parish model after Francis Spellman became Archbishop of New York in 1939. This was due to several factors, including the decline of older national parishes as parishioners died off or moved to new suburban parishes, the severe shortage of Spanish-speaking priests, and the Church's desire to demonstrate the compatibility of Catholic and American values by its ability to swiftly and effectively integrate new migrants into one American Catholic Church. With one exception in the early 19th century, every head of the Archdiocese of New York has been either Irish or Irish American since the creation of the diocese in 1908, and this continues today. The Irish domination of the Catholic Church in New York was such that the institutional church quickly came to reflect many of the cultural values of Irish Catholicism. And James Barrett actually has a new book out this year entitled The Irish Way, Becoming American in the Multi-Ethnic City, that reinforces this point very convincingly. When Puerto Ricans began migrating to the mainland in large numbers after World War II, they were, in the words of Jaime Vidal, quote, considered bad Catholics for lacking a strong sense of authority, institutional loyalty, and of sin, Catholic guilt. These are hallmarks of the Irish American Church. These cultural differences within religious practice caused American Catholic leaders in the 1940s and 1950s to perceive Puerto Ricans as a foreign population needing to be converted to the correct form of Catholic worship, and the Archdiocese of New York saw Puerto Rican neighborhoods in New York City as missionary territory. In New York, this missionary work was to serve Puerto Ricans through what was called the integrated parish model. This was a territorial or geographic parish which would include at least one bilingual priest who would provide services, such as the sermon, hymns, confession, other sacraments, in the foreign language of the targeted population. The Mass would be in Latin until Vatican II in 1965. But despite the use of bilingual priests and other religious, the goal of the church leadership was always to transition the non-English speaking parishioners to English and to drop the special second language service as quickly as possible. The church's long-standing policy of establishing national parishes was dropped in the case of Puerto Ricans, who were the first Catholic ethnic group to experience the integrated parish model. Due to the influence of the New York Archdiocese in the American Church, many other dioceses adopted the integrated parish model to deal with non-English speaking parishioners. For church leaders such as Spellman, the national parish model was an antiquated approach to Catholicism and both reinforced tribal ethnic identities and retarded integration, creating a more segregated church. And in the era of the African American Civil Rights Movement and the Cold War, segregation and ethno-racial separateness were not desirable characteristics in a church aggressively asserting its Americanness and compatibility with democracy. Although La Milagrosa and Santa Agonia continued to operate as Spanish or Hispanic parishes, Spellman declined to create new national parishes. And in the early 1940s, the Archdiocese designated the territorial parish of St. Cecilia's Church, which is at 125th Street, at 125 105th Street, to be an integrated parish for Puerto Ricans moving to what was quickly being known as Spanish Harlem. Now, Jaime Vidal has argued that one characteristic of Puerto Ricans' relationship with the church in the mainland is their traditional form of passive resistance to all forms of Americanization, particularly attempts to undermine the Spanish language. The lack of Puerto Rican priests in New York also meant that Puerto Rican migrants had no fellow ethnic advocates within the church. And Vidal writes, quote, Puerto Ricans were in no position to let it be known that if they would have preferred to have their own parishes rather than integrating into the existing ones, and their silence was taken for consent. Besides the integrated parish, the Archdiocese instituted several new programs to deal with the so-called Great Migration of Puerto Ricans to the New York City area in the 1950s and early 1960s, and several of these programs were adopted by dioceses in New Jersey. In addition to aggressively training priests, nuns, and other religious in Spanish, the New York Archdiocese created the Office of Spanish Catholic Action in 1953 to coordinate and integrate the church's work with newly arrived Puerto Ricans. It was on the recommendation of Catholic Action that the New York Archdiocese decided to celebrate the Feast of St. John the Baptist, Fiesta de San Juan, as a patronal feast beginning in 1953. But the Archdiocese diluted the power of this important symbolic action by the constant use of the term Spanish American instead of Puerto Rican, despite the fact that St. John the Baptist is the patron saint of Puerto Rico and not of other Latin American countries. And so San Juan has no strong appeal for other Spanish-speaking Catholics in the New York City area. Although the Feast of San Juan continues to be observed in New York, it lost its status as the premier event in the Puerto Rican community to the National Puerto Rican Day Parade in 1965, when the church began to use the feast as a method of religious instruction versus a community celebration in the style of fiestas in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rican Protestants also objected to the church's attempt to foster an image of Puerto Rican identity as being Catholic. But when the Feast of St. John was celebrated fiesta style in New York, it did help to bring Puerto Ricans closer to the institutional church, and it allowed Puerto Ricans to display a positive aspect of their culture to the larger metropolitan community. The Feast of St. John was never observed in New Jersey, but many Puerto Ricans living in the northeastern part of the state participated in the fiestas in New York City. Another activity that the Office of Spanish Catholic Action instituted that helped foster closer ties between Puerto Rican Catholics and the church was the Cursillos de Cristiandad, a spiritual retreat that was initially developed for men, but which came to include women in 1960. The Cursillo movement was enormously popular and did much to connect practicing Puerto Rican Catholics even closer to the institutional church. So I now would like to explain what I call the religious lay of the land in Hoboken for those who have not been to our fair city. Historically, and I encourage you to come, of course, historically Hoboken has been and still is a very Roman Catholic community. In its square mile, there are 5 Catholic parishes. Our Lady of Grace, which is at 400 Willow Avenue, built in 1855. St. Joseph's at 61 Monroe Street, established in 1874. Saints Peter and Paul at 404 Hudson Street, established in 1889. St. Francis at 308 Jefferson Street, established in 1889 also. And St. Anne's at 704 Jefferson Street, which was founded in 1903. A city of 50,000 people, Hoboken also has 15 Protestant churches of various denominations, such as Lutheran, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Baptist, Jehovah's Witness, Seventh-day Adventist, etc., 1 Jewish synagogue, and 1 Buddhist meditation center. Hoboken's Catholic churches are part of the Archdiocese of Newark, New Jersey. Among the Catholic churches in Hoboken, St. Francis and St. Anne's are Italian national parishes. meaning that they were established to promote and preserve Italian customs, traditions, and forms of Catholic worship. Until the turn of the century, both parishes were staffed by Franciscans. Saints Peter and Paul were built as a German national parish, but is now a geographic parish. Our Lady of Grace is a geographic parish, but the congregation was predominantly Irish American, and OLG, as we call it in Hoboken, was seen by Puerto Ricans and other immigrant groups in town as the American Church. St. Joseph's was founded by Franciscans for German Catholics, but served Italian parishioners until St. Francis was built in 1889. After Hoboken's Italian immigrants began attending St. Francis, St. Joseph's became a territorial parish open to all nationalities in the neighborhood. Since the 1950s, when Puerto Ricans began settling in Hoboken, St. Joseph's has been recognized by Hoboken Catholics as the Spanish Church because a Franciscan priest, Father Eugene Zval, took it upon himself to reach out to Puerto Ricans and other Spanish-speaking congregants. Zval was pastor of St. Joseph's from 1966 to 1970. Although St. Joseph's is located nowhere near where most Puerto Ricans in Hoboken lived, most Puerto Ricans attended St. Joseph's because of Father Eugene's ministry and the availability of Spanish language services. Despite its unofficial designation as the Spanish Church, St. Joseph's was never a national parish, but remained a geographic parish in accordance with the integrated parish model that the Archdiocese of Newark established in the early 1950s, following the example of New York. Father Zval also opened a storefront church called the Spanish American Catholic Center, Centro Católico, above a hardware store on the 200 block of Washington Street in 1955, and Centro provided a combination of social, religious, and social welfare services to Puerto Ricans and other Spanish-speaking Hobokenites. The Centro remained open until 1973, when it merged with St. Joseph's. Currently, St. Joseph's and Saints Peter and Paul have masses in Spanish, and these are the primary churches that Spanish-speaking Catholics in Hoboken attend, with St. Joseph's being the more popular. St. Joseph's Parish was merged into Our Lady of Grace Parish in 2008 and is currently under control of the Archdiocese of Newark. The Franciscan order withdrew from Hoboken in the late 1990s due to staffing shortages. Despite recent discussions of closing St. Joseph's for financial reasons, the church remains open and is well attended on Sundays, mainly due to the devotion of its Spanish-speaking parishioners. So I would like to explain why we wanted to focus on Puerto Ricans in Hoboken. Hoboken experienced a large Puerto Rican migration in the 1950s and 1960s, becoming the Puerto Rican town of northern New Jersey. Out of a population of 45,390 in 1970, approximately 1/4 of Hoboken's population, 10,000 people, were either born in Puerto Rico or were first-generation mainland born. Virtually all of Hoboken's Puerto Ricans settled in the city after World War II. Puerto Ricans lived in a variety of neighborhoods in Hoboken in the 1950s and 1960s, but the most well-known Puerto Rican neighborhood was the middle of town on Willow Avenue, near a Tootsie Roll factory at Willow Avenue and 14th Street. Tootsie Roll was an early recruiter and employer of labor from Puerto Rico. By the 1960s, the entire block of Willow Avenue between 11th and 13th Street consisted of Puerto Rican families, and there were also clusters of Puerto Ricans living in a few other neighborhoods. But by the 1960s, Willow Avenue was recognized by both Puerto Ricans and non-Puerto Ricans in Hoboken to be Spanish. And if you talk to old-timers in Hoboken, they will say that they considered Willow Avenue to be the DMZ between different hostile ethnic groups, and that Puerto Ricans were literally and figuratively kind of in between different conflicting groups. Many Puerto Ricans left Hoboken in the 1980s and 1990s when the city began experiencing gentrification. Some returned to Puerto Rico, others moved to other cities in Hudson County, particularly Jersey City and Union City, and of course some of the first migrants have died. The Puerto Rican community of Hoboken is increasingly elderly, and many live in subsidized housing throughout the town or in the city's public housing projects. So I'd like to now outline the study that we did. 14 people were interviewed beginning in November 2009 and ending in February 2010. 11 of the 14 respondents were born in Puerto Rico. The non-Puerto Rican interviewees were a priest, a nun, and the husband of a Puerto Rican respondent. Nearly all of the Puerto Ricans interviewed came from Puerto Rico to the New York City area as either children or teenagers in the 1950s. One came as a young man in 1967, and a woman arrived as a young adult in 1985. Another woman moved to Hoboken to live with an aunt when she was 17, and her parents followed later. Two people came as a married couple in their early 20s in 1952. But most of the respondents came as children with their parents and settled in Hoboken as families. Excuse me. All but 4 of these individuals are members of the Roman Catholic Church. One respondent is Episcopalian and was interviewed because of her political activism. This respondent is also considerably younger than the other Puerto Rican respondents, in her 50s versus 70s, and arrived later in the mid-1980s. Another non-Catholic was raised Presbyterian, but is socially active with the Feast of St. Anne's, sponsored by St. Anne's Church, which is one of our 2 Italian festivals in Hoboken. The other 2 non-Catholics are a Puerto Rican Polish-American Jewish couple who are very active in the Puerto Rican community in the 1950s and 1960s. They raised their children Jewish. All but 2 of the individuals interviewed live in Hoboken. The 2 respondents who do not are former residents who grew up in Hoboken, who now live in Jersey City, and who attend church in Hoboken. All but 4 of the Puerto Rican Catholics interviewed are parishioners of St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church. One now attends Our Lady of Grace Church, and 2 others attend St. Peter's and Paul Church. The respondents who currently do not attend St. Joseph's attended St. Joseph's as children. One does not attend church regularly but was raised Catholic. And then the others, like I said, the priest is of Italian-American heritage and the nun is of European heritage. Both live in Hoboken. The nun in particular was a former teacher at St. Joseph's and has worked with Puerto Ricans for many, many years. She currently runs our city's homeless shelter. So I asked a number of different questions which we can discuss further if you'd like, but I would like to get into my critique now of the study and what I would call problems or weaknesses. One weak link is the archival record. The Archdiocese archives for Hoboken parishes are very sparse, and the scholarly literature about Puerto Ricans' religious experiences is also quite sparse. Neither the Puerto Rican Community Archives at the Newark Public Library's New Jersey Hispanic Research and Information Center nor Centro have much documentary material about Puerto Ricans' religious experiences in New York or New Jersey. The Archdiocese of New York's archives focus, not surprisingly, on New York Catholic churches. So I was not able to do a comparison of Puerto Rican communities in New York and New Jersey. I also encountered what I call problem questions when I was interviewing people. A very common practice in social science research is to pilot test questions to understand how respondents interpret the question, because people don't always interpret questions the same way, and you can end up with very different data than you expect. But because of the small sample size, the questions for this oral history project were not pilot tested beforehand. So this resulted in what I call problem questions, as well as others that were not regularly asked because they didn't seem appropriate during the course of the interview. And of course, follow-up questions were regularly asked. That's quite typical in oral history. So the conclusions that I came to through this project are several. And I found that despite these deficiencies, I still think I came up with a rich enough quantity of material that it wasn't just for me to use, but hopefully other people can also use. So the main points that I found emerging from this research was the Puerto Rican migration in the post-World War II period obviously caught the Catholic Church by surprise. And despite institutional experience in dealing with large migrations of non-English speaking Catholics, such as Italians, Poles, other Slavs, the American Church did not apply that experience to the pastoral needs of Puerto Ricans in the 1950s and 1960s, either in New York or in New Jersey. The church, in particular, did not provide the same national parish option to Puerto Ricans that it had to other non-English speaking Catholics. Instead, it opted for the integrated parish model that promoted assimilation into Irish American style Catholicism. This policy reflected the church and the larger society's belief in the value of assimilation, especially during the Cold War and the African American Civil Rights Movement. The Catholic Church also failed to learn from its past experiences with non-English speaking Catholics that Caribbean or Spanish Catholicism is different from Iberian American Catholicism, nor did it institutionally seek to better understand the uniqueness of Puerto Rican or Caribbean forms of Catholicism. There were a few exceptions, but I would argue that the work of a few individuals did not change the bureaucratic direction of the institutional church. The church chose to spend resources to train American priests to learn Spanish rather than recruiting priests from Puerto Rico and other Spanish-speaking parts of the Caribbean, both because of a shortage of Puerto Rican priests in Puerto Rico and the belief that Puerto Ricans needed to be converted to American-style Catholicism. In Hoboken, this resulted in many American priests being trained to speak Spanish, as well as the recruitment of priests from South America and the Philippines. The church tended to lump Puerto Ricans with other Spanish speakers, particularly Cubans, defining them as Spanish or Hispanic versus Puerto Rico, thus making the cultural uniqueness of Puerto Rico less visible. Puerto Ricans tended to do the same and also referred to themselves often as Spanish or Hispanic as well as Puerto Rican, and Puerto Rican and Spanish were and still are often used interchangeably. In particular, the Catholic Church in Hoboken never created a feast of St. John's, nor did Puerto Rican Catholics seek to develop such a festival in town. Instead, Hoboken has had a Puerto Rican Day Parade, which is a secular festival and a celebration of Puerto Rican national identity versus religious or Catholic identity. This parade was held in June, beginning in 1993, but has not been held in recent years due to the organizational challenges of putting on such a large event. Hoboken and other Hudson County Puerto Ricans who wish to celebrate their ethnic heritage in this form presumably attend the National Puerto Rican Day Parade in New York City. Although it has been suggested that Hoboken did not develop a Feast of St. John's due to the lack of access to the waterfront in the 1950s as in Puerto Rico, such a problem did not prevent the Archdiocese of New York from holding huge fiestas in New York City that attracted up to 50,000 people in the late 1950s and 1960s. And in my interviews, I concentrated quite a bit on this question of why is it that there's no Puerto Rican, St. John's festival in a town where we have two Italian festivals. Since Hoboken is so close to New York City, there is a tendency on the part of the church to view Hoboken and Hudson County as satellites of the New York City Archdiocese, although the city is within the Archdiocese of Newark. Hoboken Puerto Ricans could easily travel and were bused into Manhattan to participate in and celebrate the San Juan Fiesta in New York City in the 1950s and 1960s. Like any other major institution that employs hundreds of thousands of individuals and serves millions more, the Catholic Church has a tendency toward lethargy and reaction, primarily because it is so large and bureaucratic. That being said, the church in the New York City area, including northern New Jersey, did adapt relatively quickly to this sudden change in congregant population as a result of the Puerto Rican migration, training thousands of priests, nuns, teachers, and other religious in Spanish and Caribbean and Puerto Rican culture. The Catholic Church did succeed in ministering to Puerto Ricans in Hoboken, largely due to the effort of individual priests, specifically Father Eugene Zval, who was the pastor at St. Joseph's. The Cursillo movement was also very successful in bringing practicing Puerto Rican Catholics even closer to the Catholic faith and the institutional church. Other traditionally Hispanic Catholic traditions, such as Hijas de Maria, Daughters of Mary, and Madre Cristiana, Christian Mothers, also helped bind Puerto Ricans closer to the church, but these groups only reached individuals who were already practicing Catholics, not those who were distant from the church. The project that was most successful in bringing Puerto Ricans to the church was the Spanish American Catholic Center on Washington, run by Father Zval. Centro Católico was a critical institution in the lives of thousands of Hoboken Puerto Ricans in the 1950s and 1960s. Its closure and incorporation into St. Joseph's in 1973 was a loss to the Puerto Rican community of Hoboken especially as first the recession of the 1970s and then gentrification of the 1980s and 1990s negatively impacted Puerto Ricans. After the closure of the Spanish American Catholic Center, other institutions and organizations outside the church came to meet the needs of Puerto Ricans and other poor people threatened by Hoboken's housing crisis of the 1980s. As in New York, the Catholic Church in New Jersey was never able to become the primary institution that shaped the development of the Puerto Rican community in Hoboken because not all Puerto Ricans are Catholic, and of many Puerto Ricans who are Catholic, their affinity to Catholicism is cultural and spiritual, not institutional. Instead, community development was the product of social and cultural organizations, with civic and political groups also contributing, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s. Local entrepreneurs were also quite important to the development of community in Hoboken. These entrepreneurs recognized that businesses that refused to serve Puerto Ricans were only cheating themselves, and so they and others established businesses and social organizations to meet the needs of the community. They were not satisfied with going to Spanish Harlem in New York for Puerto Rican culture. They wanted to have it in their home in Hoboken. And so finally, I would like to encourage people who are interested not just in Puerto Rican culture, but in any type of ethnic culture and history to continue to do oral history work, especially. One thing that I found in talking with these people is that despite its limitations, oral history can provide a richness of material that a lot of archival material just doesn't quite have. I know when I share the oral history material that I did with my students, they really respond to it very, very strongly. And especially I would encourage people to look at trying to preserve more of the history of the second generation mainland generation. The children of the post-World War II migrants are now senior citizens and are starting to die off. And I would argue that their experiences and their memories of their parents' experiences really need to be preserved. So thank you very much, and I would love to talk more about this work with all of you. And I should say we have some examples of our oral histories here also.
Would you tell us a little bit about the questions that you made that you were going
yeah.
to refer to?
Yes.
Yes,
of course.
And you're sitting like
Well, I just want to go read over.
And then also, I would like to know what were the probable questions.
Probable questions, yes, certainly. So I, of course, started with, after asking people's consent, because that's kind of par for the course. I asked biographical questions: where were you born, when, how old were you when you moved to Hoboken? And then I asked questions like, where did your family live in Hoboken? And because Hoboken is geographically small, it's a mile square, what's important in Hoboken is you need to know the exact address. And it was quite interesting. Everybody could remember, like number by number, house by house, all the different places that they lived in. And so to sort of map out where people lived. And I also would ask then, was this a Puerto Rican street? So if they said that they lived on a street that wasn't Willow Avenue, I would say, well, were there other Puerto Ricans living around you? Do you want to?
I'm sorry.
Oh.
I would like to know, those Puerto Ricans who immigrated between 1945 and 1970 to Hoboken, they came from the metropolitan area of Puerto Rico, they came from all over, they came from the countryside.
They came from all over.
From all over.
All over, and that was also interesting. I don't want to say expected, but I was surprised that some people came from urban areas, some people came from more rural areas. That there isn't like one sending town in Puerto Rico that then sent people to Hoboken. It's like people from all over the island came to Hoboken. So it's quite mixed.
And they work more in retail, industry.
The interviewees' parents were all working class and worked in a variety of industries. The garment industry was quite big. Food processing, Hoboken had a very large food processing industry, especially candy. A number of people's parents actually worked for Tootsie Roll. I'm trying to think of what else. Let's see. One family. The father worked as a common laborer for the railroad. So quite working class, which Hoboken was a very working class city at that point anyway. And one of the reasons why so many people settled in Hoboken was because there were a lot of these manufacturing jobs and food processing jobs. I should also say that one of the things that was interesting, some people came directly to Hoboken from Puerto Rico, but a number of people went to New York City first. And then after spending a couple of years in New York City, different parts of the city, but mostly in Spanish Harlem, then moved to Hoboken. So there was that mix also. I asked, what kind of work did your parents do? And then I also asked, what schools did you go to? And all of the respondents attended public school, which was interesting. None of them attended parochial school, and I think that had to do with income, that it's just free to go to public school. And I asked a bunch of religious questions, or questions about religion. What church did you go to? Did you go every week? Were you confirmed? What kind of religious organizations did you or your parents participate in? I asked, was the Mass in Spanish at your church after 1965? And I asked, in what ways was attending church in Hoboken different from attending church in Puerto Rico, to see if they could remember a difference. And that varied because of the ages of the people when they migrated. And I asked about the Fiesta of San Juan, the Feast of St. John. I asked why Hoboken did not have a Feast of St. John's festival itself. And I asked about other Puerto Rican organizations, labor organizations, these kind of things, and just to get a better understanding of the community. The problem questions was, I asked, when you think of the Puerto Rican community in the 1950s and 60s, what do you think of? Like, what comes to mind? And I didn't always ask that because it seemed kind of awkward. And one question that was interesting that I had a lot of trouble with that I wasn't expecting was, I asked, do you recall any tensions between Puerto Ricans and other ethnic groups in the churches? And I was trying to get at several other scholars. Barrett, among them, has actually a fair amount of documentation about conflicts, particularly between Italians and Irish Catholics in the earlier period, the pre-World War II period. And I wanted to see about whether there was this conflict. And the thing is that people would sometimes talk about discrimination, usually in housing or in jobs, but they never directly address this question about conflict within the church. And I would have to sort of explain that, well, sometimes there were problems between, say, Italians or Irish or whatever, and they say, well, maybe I hear something about that, but it always really vague, and I never really felt, part of me thought, okay, I'm leading them, and they're telling me what I want to hear. And part of it was that they didn't have direct experience, so that question just didn't work. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the level of commitment involvement in the church were less. I think there was more active in the Irish church, the lay people, and
right,
and Irish than Puerto Ricans. No,
right.
In Latin America until Second Vatican Council.
Right.
They were more passive.
Right.
The lay people were much more.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
They had to. They had no.
Right. Yeah.
Just consent what the priest said. Okay, the priest said that it's.
Yeah.
We don't do it. We don't do it.
Right.
Whereas
and
the Irish or the Italians were more.
Yeah, and I think there was also an element of, if I'm not happy with what's happening in church, maybe I just won't go to church. Maybe I'll do something else. Maybe I'll go to the Protestant Pentecostal church. That kind of element of passivism. I asked about any Puerto Rican festivals or Puerto Rican Saint Day observations that they remember. I did not have to ask about the Centro Católico because everybody mentioned it. It was like the first thing practically when you talked about the church with Puerto Ricans, they would say, oh, we had the Catholic American, center, and we had Father Eugene, and those were like the first things they talked about. So everybody always mentioned that, so I didn't really have to ask them. I also asked about whether Puerto Ricans were members of labor unions or active in our local Democratic Party, and I didn't always ask that because it wasn't really appropriate for some people who came as young children that they didn't necessarily know or really remember their parents' involvement in these organizations. And I was curious to see about Puerto Rican Catholics' interactions with non-Puerto Rican Catholics, with Puerto Rican Protestants, basically. Did they socialize, or was there kind of a prejudice against them? And I didn't really ask about that because it became very clear that was not a dividing point in the community at all. So those were the problem questions. Basically, once I got someone talking about their religious experience, I would then probe more about, how old were you when you were doing this? How long were you involved? What were your feelings about it? Those kinds of things. So we would start to have a conversation. Many of the interviews were done with couples. So some people I interviewed on their own, but in many instances, I interviewed couples together. So that was always interesting too, because then I would have two migration stories, and then I would kind of bring together their religious experiences. Many of these people, the older people, attended St. Joseph's when Father Eugene was there. A couple of them were married by him. This priest had an enormous impact on Puerto Ricans' lives in Hoboken. Yeah.
Religiosidad popular, is there no sign at all of that? I mean, processions of during Holy Week or Nuestra Señora del Carmen, La Providencia, nothing like that?
Not really. It's really kind of interesting because St. Joseph's is still going, but the two Italian festivals, which are quite large, one is sponsored by St. Francis, and the other is sponsored by St. Anne's, the Feast of St. Anne. St. Joseph's does not do anything beyond kind of their own little internal fundraising. That the larger community really has little to no exposure. If you are not a practicing Catholic in Hoboken, and even say if you don't live in that neighborhood, you probably would not know anything about that church. Whereas if you live in Hoboken and you're not a practicing Catholic, you know about the Feast of St. Anne's because it's a big festival. It goes on for more than a week. They parade the Virgin, the statue through the street from the back of town to the front of town. They do that for the Italian festival. At St. Francis, they put a statue of the Madonna on this enormous bier, and they carry it all the way to the waterfront. They float her out the river. They bring her back. I mean, it's a huge thing. People come from other towns in New Jersey. So it's very different. You really have to kind of probe into what's happening at St. Joseph's. So it's different.
What did you ask the other people, the nuns and the priests?
I asked them about, when they became religious, not when they became religious, but when they became a-religious, when they became a nun or a priest, their spiritual training, what order were they a member of, what kinds of, with the priest, because he is attached to St. Francis, which is very Italian. They still have Italian Mass there. I asked him if he knew Father Eugene. I asked him about other priests that he remembered who worked with Puerto Ricans. I asked him what he remembered about basically the internal discussions within the local priesthood about how are you going to minister to this congregation. With the nun, because of her work with Puerto Ricans really outside the church and dealing with housing issues, anti-poverty, civil rights issues in the 70s and 80s. I asked her about her work. I also asked her, because she had been at St. Joseph's, about this issue of the institutional versus, or the integrated versus national parish, that whole discussion. So that was quite enlightening. I found both those conversations to be really helpful because not only am I not Puerto Rican, I'm also not Catholic. So talking to someone who, knows all of the lingo, in effect, was really useful. Anything else?
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
So Father Eugene was gone, no?
Yes, he died several years ago, and actually another priest